right, welcome to the deep dive. You know, you guys have sent in a really incredible collection of sources this time.
Yeah.
And honestly, they paint a picture, like a pretty epic one. It's a 1,500-year journey, really, of how the English language became what it is.
Wow.
And we're going to dive into that.
Okay.
So we're going to look at how it went from, like, what it seems like a pretty isolated, tribal dialect
Right.
to this global force that it is today.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere, exactly.
I mean, it's amazing to think about.
It is. And we're going to look at, its very beginnings, how it managed to actually survive invasions, even like periods of suppression.
Oh, yeah.
It's just incredible ability to just soak up influences from everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, of course, where it is now, like a worldwide language. So our mission here is to kind of pull out like the juiciest insights from this whole linguistic adventure, right? And hopefully give you a clear and engaging understanding of how English became the language we know.
Yeah, the language we're speaking now. Yeah. The language we're speaking right now.
That's wild.
So let's get into it. Let's unpack this thing.
Okay.
Right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Like the very, very beginning.
So we're talking about 1,500 years ago.
Yeah.
To a region now known as Frisia.
Frisia?
Yeah, part of the modern Netherlands.
Okay.
The ancestor of English was spoken there.
Really?
And you know what's really interesting? Modern Frisian still sounds pretty similar to what that early English might have sounded like.
Oh, wow.
It's amazing, that connection to the past.
That's a real, like, tangible link.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Like, you can almost hear it, right?
You can almost hear those echoes.
I was looking at the word lists you sent, the early ones.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many, like, core words
Yeah.
have just stuck around. Butter, bread, cheese.
Like basic words.
Basic meal, sleep, boat, snow, sea, and even storm.
Wow.
All of them sharing West Germanic roots with Frisian.
Now, this West Germanic, for folks who might not know, this refers to like...
Yeah, break it down. That branch of the Germanic language family where both early English and Frisian come from.
So they're like linguistic cousins.
They are close cousins.
Okay, very close.
And it kind of paints a picture of, these early speakers.
Yeah.
As this, one of the sources described them as warlike, adventurous people.
Oh, wow.
Always on the move.
So that spirit of adventure, it's key to the story because in the 5th century, those tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes,
those guys,
they set sail across the North Sea, right?
Headed for Britain?
To Britain, bringing their language with them.
And this is important to remember.
Yeah.
This wasn't like an empty island.
No.
The Romans had been there, like over 500 years?
Yeah.
But they had left. Leaving the native Celtic people, the Britons, kind of vulnerable.
And the arrival of the Germanic tribes, had a huge impact.
Huge impact.
Really profound and honestly brutal impact on the Celts.
Yeah.
One thing that you pointed out that was really chilling.
The invaders, they used the word willis for the Celts.
Which is so interesting because it means both foreigner and slave.
Wow.
It's a linguistic link,
And it reveals that immediate subjugation that followed, right?
Yeah.
So the Celts, they weren't totally wiped out,
right?
But they were very much relegated to second-class citizens.
Yeah.
And assimilation into the invaders' culture and language
became essential.
Became their only path, really, to any sort of improvement.
And even the name Welsh still echoes this history.
That's so interesting.
This early example really shows how language can be used to, dehumanize and control a population.
A subjugated population.
And this happens throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
The recurring theme.
And it's not just that the language of the dominant group becomes the language of power.
Right.
It actually shapes how they perceive.
It shapes perception.
And categorize the marginalized.
Absolutely. Despite all of this upheaval, Old English, as this early form was called, it took root.
It did.
And it's really incredible to think how many words we use today are directly from Old English.
That's the foundation
of our
vocabulary.
I was looking at those lists you gave me.
Yeah.
Nouns like youth, son, daughter, field, friend, home, and ground.
Like home, ground. These are so basic.
The basic prepositions like in, on, into, by, and from. Even words like and the.
The numbers.
All are numbers.
All of them, yeah.
And verbs like drink, come, go, sing, like, and love.
It's Amazing.
Now, of course, the pronunciation would have been different.
Right, right.
I mean, sun was sunu, game was gamen, ground was grun.
Oh, wow. I like that.
But surprisingly, you could actually have a basic conversation
Really?
in Old English.
Just using those words?
And they had about 25,000 words at the time.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, smaller than today's, but still pretty substantial. So the next big influence, right, came with the arrival of Christianity.
Right.
In 597 AD.
Big year.
Huge year, because this brought in Latin and
Latin.
the international language of the church.
The language of scholarship, the language of religion.
So this is the first big wave of foreign words.
Being adopted into English.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting how certain areas of life often drive linguistic borrowing.
It makes sense.
So with Christianity, we see all these religious words coming in.
Oh, yeah.
Like altar, apostle, mass, monk, and verse.
Right, right.
All coming from Latin.
Into the English word horde.
Yeah, it established a pattern that would continue throughout English history.
Of just absorbing.
Absorbing it.
As needed.
Taking what it needs.
That's fascinating. And it wasn't just words.
No.
Christianity also brought a whole new way of writing.
Right.
So the Anglo-Saxons, they initially used runes.
Yeah, the Germanic alphabet.
Right, which were perfect for carving.
Good for carving.
But the Latin alphabet?
With all the curves?
With those curves?
Yeah.
It was much better for pen and ink on parchment.
Right.
And this led to the creation of books.
It fostered a whole culture of scholarship.
So Old English, it started being written down.
Using that Latin alphabet.
And they even, incorporated some old runes.
As letters.
As letters. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It was a huge step.
For the language.
For its development, right.
Totally.
Allowing the recording of prayers, laws, even translations of the Bible.
So by the 9th century,
okay,
English had this unique position in Europe.
Because
they had this written vernacular tradition.
Now, this vernacular tradition, break that down for us.
It means that, unlike much of Europe at the time, where scholarship was all in Latin, England had actually begun writing down important texts in their everyday spoken language.
Which was?
English. English, exactly. It was a big achievement.
For a relatively young language.
Very young.
Very young.
So English had survived invasions.
Yeah.
Absorbed Latin and Old Norse.
Had royal backing, scholarly backing.
Right.
Seemed to be on solid ground.
Yeah, it was thriving.
But that 1066.
The Norman Conquest.
The Norman Conquest. And from what I read in these sources, this might have been the biggest threat to the English language ever.
Huge. Huge, right?
The stability, the growing prestige.
Everything.
Yeah, about to face its biggest test.
So the Norman Conquest, break it down for us.
Okay, so William the Conqueror and his Norman French-speaking aristocracy, they took over
everything.
Everything. The monarchy, the government, the law, the church.
Wow.
French became the language of the ruling class.
Oh, wow.
For almost 300 years.
Really?
Yeah, and English was pushed to the sideline.
Like the language of the common people?
The common people, yeah.
And written English, which had been doing so well.
Flourishing under Alfred.
Yeah, went into decline.
A big decline.
And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it just stopped.
Ceased.
It's almost as if English went underground.
Underground.
Or that time.
But despite being ignored
officially
by the ruling elite, it was still spoken by the majority of the population.
Like 90%.
90%, that's a lot.
Yeah, huge.
So survived.
They're not just surviving, it kept evolving.
Evolving.
You know, influenced by that earlier contact with Old Norse.
Right, especially in the North.
Especially in the North, yeah.
So this underground period, it was actually a time of real change.
It was.
For the language.
Yeah.
So the grammar kept getting simpler.
So you see more plurals being formed by adding S.
Oh, okay.
Prepositions are doing more work. And the word order is getting more fixed.
Like the foundation of Middle English.
Exactly. Middle English was starting to take shape.
And over the centuries, the grip of French, it started to loosen.
Yeah.
It was inevitable, right?
It was.
That English speakers and their French rulers would start to interact more.
And mingle their vocabularies.
Mingle those words.
Yeah. And one early example of this was falconry.
Falconry.
Yeah. So these areas where they had shared activities, expertise, you often see that linguistic exchange happen.
So French, it gave a lot of words to English.
It did a ton.
Especially in areas like law, government, art, and cuisine.
Like justice, parliament.
Beef, pork.
Delicious beef and pork.
So these words often coexisted with Old English words.
Right, side by side.
Side by side.
And sometimes these paired words develop different meanings over time.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so like the word apple.
Yeah.
It narrowed to mean a specific fruit.
Ooh.
Because fruit had come in from French.
So by the late 13th century, something big started to happen.
Oh, yeah.
A sense of English identity. It started to reemerge.
Like a resurgence.
A resurgence, even among families that were, originally of Norman descent.
They'd been there a while.
They'd been there a while.
Yeah.
And when the French king threatened invasion in 1295.
Yeah, King Edward I, he actually used English as a symbol of nationhood.
Oh, wow.
To rally his people.
That's incredible.
And he famously said that the French, they wanted to wipe out our English language entirely from the earth.
Wow.
That's a powerful statement.
That's a powerful statement.
So this was a real turning point.
Yeah.
Language and national identity
Became intertwined.
They were totally intertwined.
So even though Latin and French were still, the languages of like official stuff.
The official languages.
English was becoming more and more powerful.
It had symbolic power.
And then 1399.
Another big year.
Big year.
Henry IV, he claims the throne.
Right.
And he does it in English.
In English.
His mother tongue.
Wow.
Not Latin or French.
English is back, baby.
English is back as a language of royalty.
For the first time in centuries.
Centuries.
What a move.
I know, it's a big move.
Huge symbolic weight.
Signal a real shift.
In the power dynamics.
Of the linguistic landscape.
And right as English was making this comeback.
It found a champion.
A champion.
In literature.
And that champion was?
Geoffrey Chaucer.
Geoffrey Chaucer by the end of the 14th century.
Yeah.
And his Canterbury Tales.
Written in, the London dialect of the time.
Really showed the world what English could do.
The literary potential.
Literary potential.
He drew on everything.
He did. He used high and low vocabulary, French words, Old English words.
He wasn't afraid to mix it up.
He was not afraid to experiment.
He used French words for that poetic effect.
Yeah.
But he also coined his own, elevated synonyms.
He was inventing.
He was playing with the language.
He loved it.
And at the same time, he loved the directness of Old English.
Yeah, especially for his more earthy tales.
Right, right.
So his work showed
the world
that English was a language.
Fit for great literature.
Worthy of great literature.
It solidified its place.
Absolutely.
In the cultural landscape.
And then, this desire to make the Bible accessible in English.
Right. It became a real struggle.
A struggle.
People like John Wycliffe.
Yeah.
They championed English translations.
Yeah.
They believed the Word of God should be understandable to all.
To all.
And this movement faced huge opposition.
Oh, yeah.
From the church.
They wanted to keep that control.
They did. They liked the
authority of Latin.
Of Latin, yeah.
So this was a battle for the language of faith.
It really was.
Yeah.
It really was.
But it
shows the importance.
Yeah.
Of the vernacular, the everyday language.
And that desire for an English Bible, it kind of set the stage.
Yeah, it did. The Renaissance. Meaning rebirth.
Rebirth.
It was a rebirth for the English language, too.
In a big way. Huge.
The vocabulary just exploded.
It exploded, like 10,000 to 12,000 new words.
Wow.
It was driven by exploration, by trade, by a renewed interest in classical learning.
And 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
Another big year.
Huge year.
For England.
It fostered this sense of national pride.
Yeah, which is reflected in the language.
It's all there in the language.
That growing richness of English.
Yeah. And their naval supremacy.
Opened up the world to trade.
Global trade.
New goods, new words.
New words from everywhere.
Like, it's mind-blowing, the variety.
It really is.
We see crew, detail from French.
Embargo, tornado from Spanish and Portuguese.
Yacht, landscape from Dutch.
And then, even further afield, bamboo from Chinese.
Wow.
Ketchup from Malay. Curry from Tamil.
Coffee from Arabic.
And, of course, balcony and fresco from Italian.
It's a real melting pot.
Melting pot of vocabulary.
Oh, a vocabulary. Yeah, that's amazing. But alongside all these foreign words, the language of the streets,
that simple, direct language.
He was thriving.
Thriving.
And by the late 16th century...
Public theaters like the Globe.
Yeah, the Globe.
Were hugely popular.
Hugely popular.
Attracting all kinds of audiences.
So this was like a breeding ground.
A fertile ground, yeah.
For new words.
New words, new phrases, linguistic innovation.
And we can't talk about this era without talking about Shakespeare.
William Shakespeare.
I mean, his impact on English is immeasurable.
It really is.
He, along with his contemporaries, they really captivated these audiences.
They knew how to tell a story.
They knew how to tell a story. And his genius.
It wasn't just the story.
It wasn't just the stories. It was the way he used language.
Yeah, that rapidly evolving English.
So many words and phrases we still use today.
We owe them to Shakespeare.
We owe them to Shakespeare.
Yeah, his work exposed English to this huge audience.
It showed its power.
Yeah, its dramatic and poetic power.
English could express the whole range.
The whole range, yeah.
Of human experience.
And it wasn't just for scholars and poets anymore.
Right.
It was ready to go global.
Ready to go global.
You know what?
What?
It did go global.
It did. In the 17th century.
English crossed the Atlantic.
With the first settlers.
Those brave souls.
Yeah, going to America.
Yeah, to America.
And American English?
It was rooted in British English, of course.
Right, but
it started to develop its own character.
Almost immediately.
Almost immediately, yeah.
Different vocabulary.
Vocabulary pronunciation.
I was looking at those early colonial documents you said.
You could already see the differences.
Yeah, there are some really interesting ones.
Some interesting divergences.
So shop became store.
Right.
Lumber meant rubbish in Britain.
Yeah.
But in America, it meant cut timber.
Cut timber, yeah.
And haul meant to transport something in a vehicle.
Not just to move it by force.
Not just to move it by force.
It's fascinating.
It is.
How these subtle shifts happened.
What about American accents?
Oh, yeah.
How did those develop?
So the first settlers, they came from all different parts of England.
Right.
With their own regional accents.
Yeah.
So no one accent dominated.
Oh.
And as they interacted, their speech blended more readily than in Britain. And that's why you see less variation in accents across America today.
Especially as you move west.
Especially out west, yeah.
By the 18th century, some British observers, they were actually quite surprised.
They commented on the purity and perfection of the English spoken in America.
That's amazing.
And the American Revolution.
Yeah.
It really fueled this sense of linguistic independence.
And the Declaration of Independence itself?
It was written in
was considered
classical English.
Wow, that's interesting.
And the sense of independence was further solidified by guys like Noah Webster.
Noah Webster.
He was so important.
Yeah.
He formalized American English with his dictionary.
He standardized spellings.
And he often simplified British forms.
Right, like honor versus on.
Theater versus theater.
Yeah, yeah.
So then we get to the 19th century.
Yeah.
Westward expansion.
Of
the United States.
And that brought
even more linguistic innovation.
More new words.
New words, new phrases, especially related to river travel, gambling, the frontier.
It was like a whole new vocabulary.
It was.
Diverging from the West.
And tall talk.
Oh, yeah, tall.
That exaggerated style of speech.
It became like a hallmark.
A hallmark of American speech.
And we can't forget the influence
of African-American English.
Yeah.
It evolved in really unique ways.
Yeah.
Among enslaved Africans.
Right.
And it began to have a big impact.
A huge impact.
On mainstream American English.
On rhythm, on vocabulary.
On so much.
What?
And then you have the cowboy.
The cowboy, yeah.
This iconic figure of the Wild West.
They brought in all those words from Spanish.
Yeah, like ranch, corral, Mustang, sombrero, lasso.
It's amazing how much Spanish
contributed
to American English.
And Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows.
Yeah.
They really popularized that image.
Of the cowboy.
Yeah.
And that language.
It shaped
how the world
saw American English.
Saw American English.
And then, of course, you have the waves of immigration.
In the late 19th century.
Bringing in even more linguistic richness. German, Yiddish, other European languages.
All being absorbed into American English.
It's a constant process of absorption and adaptation.
Meanwhile, back in Britain.
Britain.
In the 18th century.
There's this quest for proper English.
Proper English.
The age of reason.
The age of reason.
People wanted to standardize and improve the language.
And guys like Jonathan Swift.
Oh, yeah. He actually proposed an academy.
An
academy to ascertain English.
Ascertain English?
He was afraid of its corruption.
Oh, wow.
These attempts to control language, to fix it. They show how much people want to impose order on something as fluid and organic as language.
It's always changing.
It's always changing.
And then, of course, there's Dr. Samuel Johnson.
With his famous dictionary.
A dictionary of the English language.
Published in 1755.
It was monumental. a real landmark achievement.
Yeah, although Johnson himself later realized
Yeah.
how hard it is to actually fix a living language.
Yeah, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
It's impossible.
Impossible.
And this era also saw the rise of grammar guides.
Right, and prescriptivism.
Prescriptivism, yeah. Telling people how they should speak.
How they should speak, yeah.
And some people even tried to standardize spoken English.
Really?
They even tried to iron out regional variations.
Like in Scotland?
Yeah. They wanted everyone to speak the same way.
Interesting.
And, even within London, you had these distinct dialects.
Like Cockney?
Cockney, with its rhyming slang.
Thriving,
even though some people saw it as uncouth.
Right.
Not proper.
So the First World War...
Yeah, early 20th century.
It had its own impact on the language.
It brought in new vocabulary.
And some modern warfare.
Modern warfare, yeah.
The 20th century...
The 20th century saw a big shift in global influence.
Towards America.
Towards America, yeah.
So while Europe was busy with war...
The U.S. was experiencing huge industrial growth.
And that led to...
The Great Migration. Of African Americans to northern cities.
And a new energy...
poured into the language.
Through jazz and blues.
It was an exciting time.
It was, and Black American speech.
Yeah.
It had a huge influence.
It really did.
On mainstream American English.
Contributed so many words and expressions.
About music, culture, everyday life.
And still ongoing. And immigration continued in the early 20th century.
Bringing even more diversity.
More diversity, more words, more speech patterns.
From all over Europe.
It's an ever-evolving
tapestry of language.
And then mass media. Especially movies. Revolutionized.
American English.
All across the globe.
Some in Britain were a little bit outraged.
They thought American English was vulgar.
They didn't like the vocabulary, the accent.
Definitely.
It was too powerful.
Too powerful to resist.
Yeah.
So by the late 20th, early 21st century,
English had become...
the lingua franca.
A lingua franca.
Of global communication.
It's the language.
Of business, science, diplomacy, the internet.
Of so many domains.
And while Mandarin Chinese might have more native speakers, English is used much more in international trade.
And why is that?
Well, your sources pointed to a few factors.
Yeah.
First, English grammar is relatively simple.
Compared to some other languages.
Yeah, it's lost those complex word endings.
Right.
And then internationally, sellers often have to speak the language of buyers.
Makes sense.
It's just practical.
Yeah.
And of course, you can't ignore the legacy of the British Empire.
Right, and the economic and cultural influence of the U.S.
All these factors contributed to English's dominance.
But as English has spread globally...
It's also diversified. It's now an official or semi-official language in over 60 countries.
Wow.
And this widespread adoption is leading to new varieties of English.
Like Singlish in Singapore.
Singlish, yeah, incorporating local vocabulary and grammar.
It's fascinating.
It is.
So looking ahead,
the
future of English.
It's probably going to be characterized by this tension.
What tension?
Between a standardized global English used in international context and this tendency for English to adapt
and
mix with local languages.
So we could see
more linguistic diversity.
Yeah.
Maybe new dialects emerging.
That might not even be mutually intelligible.
Yeah, like what happened with Latin centuries ago.